Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Trail of Whispers. I've always been fascinated by hiking and camping. The silence of the forests and being in touch with nature gave me a sense of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. So when my friend Pedro suggested we explore the Whispering Forest, I didn't hesitate. He mentioned there were legends about the place, but none of them seemed serious enough to scare us. People said travelers heard inexplicable voices, and some even disappeared without a trace. We thought they were just exaggerated stories meant to keep curious people away. We arrived at the forest on a cloudy day, the kind of weather that seemed perfect for an adventure. The entrance was marked by an old, worn-out sign that read, "Conservation Area, enter at your own risk." Pedro laughed, saying it was the most dramatic way to discourage visitors. We passed the sign and entered the main trail. At first it was calm. The tall trees formed a natural canopy, blocking out much of the sunlight, but it was still easy to see the path ahead. The air was fresh, though a bit heavier than usual, as if we were breathing in a closed space. We walked for about an hour until we reached a clearing where we decided to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by trees gently swaying in the breeze. After setting up our tents, we went out to explore the trail. The walk was silent. There were no sounds of birds or animals, just the sound of our footsteps on the dry leaves. At first I found it relaxing, but soon the silence started to feel wrong. It was as if the forest was watching us. About 20 minutes later, I heard the first sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like a whisper. I stopped and looked at Pedro, who had also heard it. "Probably just the wind," he said, trying to sound confident. We continued walking, but the sound persisted. Sometimes it seemed to come from behind us, other times from in front of us. When we finally decided to head back to camp, we noticed something that sent chills down our spines. Footprints. They were fresh, but not ours. They followed the same direction as the trail, but the marks were different, larger and deeper. We returned to camp, where the air felt even colder. As we started the campfire, the whispers returned, but now they were louder and clearer. It felt like someone was talking around us, but we couldn't understand the words. Pedro started to get visibly nervous. "I think we should leave here first thing tomorrow," he said, looking around as if expecting something to appear. When night fell completely, the forest became even more frightening. The light from the campfire barely reached far, and the whispering never stopped. Then Pedro suddenly stood up, pointing towards the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I looked in the direction he was pointing, and for a brief moment, I saw a dark figure among the trees. It was tall and thin, with undefined contours, almost like a shadow in human form. When I shone my lantern on it, it disappeared. We decided it was best to spend the night in the car, which we had left at the edge of the forest, but when we grabbed our things to leave, something strange happened. The trail leading to the car seemed to have changed. The trees seemed closer together, and the path was darker than before. We started walking faster, trying to ignore the whispers that now sounded like low, distorted laughter. It was then that we realized we were being followed. Among the trees, figures began to appear. They were dark and moved slowly, but they were always there watching us. Each time we looked back, they seemed closer. My heart was racing, and Pedro was gripping my arm tightly. Finally, after running for several minutes, we saw the car. We jumped in quickly, locked the doors, and Pedro started the engine. When the headlights illuminated the road, we saw something that froze us in place. A tall, thin figure was standing in the middle of the path. It had no face, only a dense shadow where its eyes and mouth should have been. Pedro sped up, but as we passed it, the figure vanished. The rest of the journey was silent, both of us trying to process what had just happened. Since that night, something changed. Pedro never spoke about the forest again, and I started noticing strange things. In moments of silence, I hear whispers like those from that night. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel as if someone is watching me from a distance. Story 2. The Cabin in the Clearing. I've always loved exploring forests and discovering secluded spots. so when a friend suggested camping in a little-known forest reserve, I agreed without thinking twice. The Lost Clearing Forest had a reputation for being dangerous. Locals told stories about a cabin that appeared and disappeared, and those who got too close were never seen again. We laughed at these legends, thinking they were just local tales. We arrived at the forest in the morning, backpacks loaded and old maps to guide us. The entrance was simple, marked by a wide trail winding between tall, twisted trees. The place seemed calm with the sound of birds and the fresh smell of damp earth. After hours of walking, we found the perfect clearing to set up camp. But something in the air felt strange. The silence was heavier, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. As we set up camp, my friend Paolo noticed something between the trees in the distance. "I think I saw a cabin," he said, pointing. "Want to check it out?" I laughed and agreed. If there was a cabin, it would be interesting to see it. We grabbed our lanterns and followed the direction he pointed to. It didn't take long for the trail to disappear, and we began walking through denser trees. That's when we saw it. The cabin was there, small and old, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Its walls were covered in moss, and the half-open door creaked gently in the wind. As we got closer, the air grew colder. The smell of rotting wood was strong, mixed with something metallic. When we stepped inside, the cabin felt even older. The floor was dirt, and there were simple pieces of furniture. A broken wooden table, a tipped-over chair, and, in the corner, a cold fireplace. But what caught our attention was a mark on the floor, made of ashes, forming a circle with symbols none of us recognized. "Looks like some kind of ritual," Paolo murmured, uneasy. As we examined the circle, something outside caught my attention. Through the slats in the wall, I saw a movement. I rushed to the door and looked outside, but there was no one there. That's when I heard the first sound. It was low and indistinct, like whispers coming from the trees. I thought I was imagining things, but when I looked at Paolo, I saw he was hearing it too. "We should head back to camp," he suggested, his voice tense. As we left the cabin, I felt as if something was watching us. The path back seemed longer, and the whispers followed us all the way. When we finally reached the clearing, the sun was setting. We decided it would be better not to return to the cabin, but that night, the sounds continued. Around midnight, I was awakened by something scratching the side of my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when I heard a low, distorted laugh, I froze. I grabbed my lantern, and Paolo was right beside me, pale. "It's coming from the direction of the cabin," he said. Without thinking twice, we started packing up to leave. But before we could finish, we saw something at the edge of the clearing. A tall, thin figure was standing there, motionless, its head tilted as if it were watching us. When we shone the lantern on it, it disappeared. The trail back felt different, as if the trees had closed in around us. The whispers grew louder, now mixed with light footsteps that seemed to follow us. Finally, we found a car and left as quickly as we could. The next morning, we went to the nearest village to tell what happened. An older man listened in silence and said, "You saw the cabin? You should have never gone in." Since that day, I've had recurring dreams about that cabin. In the dreams, I'm standing in the ash circle while whispers around me turn into screams. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I hear scratching on the walls of my house, just like that night. Story 3, The Endless Path. My brother Daniel and I have always enjoyed exploring forests and remote trails. When we heard about a forest called the Forest of Eternity, famous for its legends of endless paths, we couldn't resist. The story spoke of people who entered and ended up walking in circles, unable to find their way out, until they either gave up or simply disappeared. We arrived at the forest late in the morning, a place surrounded by tall, dark trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The trail entrance seemed ordinary, but there was something strange in the air. There was an absolute silence, as if the forest were studying us. Daniel made a joke to lighten the mood, but I could tell he was uneasy too. We walked for almost an hour. The trail was well defined, with markings from other adventurers on the trees and some stones lined up along the path. However, after a while, we began to notice something strange. We passed by a fallen log, and about 20 minutes later, we saw the same log again. We laughed at the possibility of getting lost, but when this happened a third time, we began to worry. "This can't be possible. We've been walking straight," Daniel said, trying to sound confident. We decided to stop for a few minutes to study the map and GPS. To our surprise, the GPS showed that we were at the same spot since we entered the forest, even though we had been walking for hours. The discomfort grew, but we decided to continue. That's when we heard the first sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like a whisper coming from the trees. We stopped and looked around, but there was no one there. Daniel suggested it might just be leaves blowing in the wind, but there was no wind at all. The air was still, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Not long after, we found something that made us freeze. In the middle of the trail, there was an old backpack. When we got closer, we noticed it was torn and dirty, as if it had been there for years. Next to it was a pair of worn-out boots, but no sign of who could have left them. Daniel picked up the backpack and opened it, finding a wet notebook with drawings of trees and strange symbols. "I think we should leave now," he said, and I agreed. We turned back in the direction we thought was the exit, but the path seemed different. The trees were closer together, and the trail, once clear, was now covered in leaves and branches. That's when we realized we were walking in circles again. With each turn, the environment seemed to change. The trees looked taller, the branches more twisted, and the whispers grew louder. Now, it was impossible to ignore them. They sounded like overlapping voices, some calling our names, others laughing softly. Daniel began to panic. "This doesn't make sense," he shouted. "The exit must be close." As he spoke, we saw something between the trees. It was a dark figure with contours that blended into the surroundings. It didn't move, but its presence was oppressive. I grabbed Daniel by the arm and we started running, not looking back. The sound of whispers turned into distorted screams, and heavy footsteps began to follow us. After what felt like hours, we finally saw daylight. We exited the forest, gasping for breath, our faces pale and our clothes torn by the branches. When we looked back, the trail seemed darker than ever. We decided we would never return. A few weeks later, Daniel started having recurring nightmares about the forest. He said that in the dreams, he was trapped on an endless path, surrounded by voices laughing at him. As for me, sometimes, in moments of silence, I hear the same whispers from that trail, as if the forest is still trying to call me back. Story 4. The Dark Lake. My girlfriend Clara and I always sought out secluded places to camp. When she found a trail that led to a hidden lake deep in a dense forest, the idea seemed perfect. The place was known as the Dark Lake, but local stories said that few ventured there because the lake had an owner. We didn't pay much attention to this. We thought it was just folklore. We arrived at the forest on a cold, cloudy morning. The trail was narrow, flanked by trees so tall they nearly blocked out the sun. Clara was excited while I tried to hide the growing unease I felt. Something about the forest felt wrong. The air was still, and the sounds of nature were strangely muffled, as if the forest itself were watching us. After hours of walking, we reached the lake. It was beautiful and eerie at the same time. The water was dark, reflecting the surrounding trees like a shadowy mirror. There were no waves, no movement, just a still surface that seemed to swallow the light. Clara, mesmerized, suggested we set up camp near the shore. As we pitched the tent, I began to notice disturbing details. There were marks on the ground, like bare footprints leading to the water, but none returning. When I mentioned this to Clara, she laughed and told me I was being paranoid. "It's just a forest, Lucas. Relax." That night, while we were eating near the campfire, I heard the first sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like distant singing coming from the direction of the lake. I asked Clara if she heard it, but she denied it, although she seemed uneasy. The sound persisted for a while before fading into the darkness. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. It sounded like something dragging along the edge of the lake, near the tent. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside, trying to be as quiet as possible. A thick fog had formed around the lake, making it hard to see. I shone the lantern along the shore and saw something that froze me to the core. A figure was standing in the water. It was a woman, or at least it seemed to be. Her long hair was wet, partially covering her face. She wasn't moving, but I felt her eyes fixed on me. I called for Clara, but when I looked back, she was already at my side, holding a lantern. "Who is that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the woman in the water began to move slowly toward us. But she wasn't walking, she seemed to float as if the water was carrying her. Clara grabbed me and we ran back to the tent, quickly sealing it behind us. The sound of something dragging continued outside, along with a low, mournful song that made my head spin. The next morning, we decided to leave immediately. But as we packed up the camp, we noticed something strange. At the spot where the figure had been in the water, there were marks on the shore like hands scratching at the earth. Clara was visibly shaken and I was too. We hurried back down the trail as fast as we could. When we reached the car, we both breathed a sigh of relief, but as I looked back at the forest one last time, something froze me in place. The same woman was standing between the trees, motionless, her head tilted slightly as if watching us. A few weeks later, Clara began having nightmares. She said that the woman from the lake called to her, whispering her name, asking her to return. As for me, whenever I hear the sound of water and silence, I feel like someone is watching me. And sometimes I dream of the lake, its still water, and the shadowy figure that never stops following me. Story 5. The Forest of the Lost Spirits. I was never very superstitious, but after that night, my beliefs changed forever. The Forest of the Lost Spirits was a place known for its legends. It was said that those who entered at night would hear the voices of missing people, and that the trees hid shadows that belonged to no one. When my friends suggested camping there as a challenge, I hesitated but eventually agreed. We arrived at the forest late in the afternoon with backpacks full and flashlights ready. The entrance to the forest was dark, with trees so tall and dense that they blocked almost all the sunlight. The ground was covered with dry leaves, and the air had a strong smell of damp earth. As we walked toward the campsite, one of my friends, Raphael, commented, "It feels like time stopped in here." I silently agreed. The atmosphere was different from any forest we had visited before. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling of being watched. We set up our tents in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean in our direction. As the sun disappeared, the silence grew deeper. There were no crickets, birds, or any signs of wildlife. Only the sound of our voices and the occasional crackle of the fire. After a while, Raphael suggested we explore the surroundings. Reluctantly, I grabbed my lantern and followed him, while our third friend Enrique decided to stay at the camp. We walked for about 20 minutes until we came across a narrow path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. That's when we heard the first sound. It was a whisper, low and indistinct, coming from all directions. We stopped and looked around, but there was no one. Raphael tried to laugh, but his voice faltered. "Maybe it's the wind," he said, trying to sound confident. We continued walking, but the whispers grew clearer. Now they seemed like voices calling our names. When I looked back, I saw something that made me freeze. Between the trees, a dark figure stood still. It was tall and thin, with disproportionately long arms. When I shone the lantern on it, the figure vanished. "We need to go back now," I said, grabbing Raphael's arm. On the way back, the trail seemed different. The trees were closer together, and the ground was covered in marks that hadn't been there before, barefoot footprints going back and forth in circles. The whispers turned into distorted laughter, and the feeling that something was following us became overwhelming. When we finally reached the clearing, we found Enrique standing near the campfire, staring blankly at the trees. His expression was vacant, and he didn't respond when we called out to him. That's when we saw it. Shadows began to appear in the trees around the clearing, moving erratically as if dancing. Suddenly, Enrique looked at us, but his eyes were strange, almost glazed. He mumbled something we couldn't understand and pointed toward the darkness. When we looked in the direction he was pointing, we saw a figure slowly emerging from the shadows. It was the same one we had seen before, tall and disproportionate, but now it was much closer. Without thinking twice, we grabbed our things and ran toward the exit. The trees seemed to close in on the path, and the whispers were so loud that it was hard to hear our own footsteps. Finally, we reached the car and drove off without looking back. Enrique didn't say a word the entire way back. A few weeks later, we found out that Enrique had disappeared. When we went to his house to find out what happened, we found only a note on his desk. It said, "They called me back." I can't ignore it. Since then, I've had nightmares about that forest. In my dreams, I'm surrounded by shadows and the voices call my name over and over. Sometimes I wake up with the feeling that something is in my room watching me. Story 6. The Valley of Shadows. When I accepted a coworker's invitation to camp in the Valley of Shadows, I didn't know what to expect. He described the place as a secluded and almost untouched forest, perfect for those who love adventure. But he also mentioned the local stories. They said that the valley was a place where the shadows of the trees seemed to come alive at night. Though intrigued, I laughed off the stories and accepted the challenge. We arrived at the Valley at dusk. The entrance was a narrow trail that descended down a gentle slope, surrounded by gigantic, moss-covered trees. The air was damp, almost sticky, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind seemed louder than usual. When we reached a clearing, we realized how strange the environment felt. The sunlight barely filtered through the treetops, and the ground was covered in dry leaves that seemed untouched for years. As we set up the tents, I noticed that the silence around us was almost complete. There were no birds or insects, only the sound of our movements. My coworker, Andre, tried to break the tension by telling jokes, but we both knew that something about the place unsettled us. As night fell, the valley seemed to transform. The trees, once towering and static, now cast long, distorted shadows in the firelight. Staring at them for too long gave an odd sense of discomfort, as if the shadows were shifting slightly, even though there was no wind. Around 10 p.m., we began to hear the first sound. It was a soft whisper coming from the trees. At first, we thought it was the wind, but as we focused, we realized it sounded like a voice, or rather, multiple voices overlapping. Andre suggested we check the surroundings, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We grabbed our lanterns and followed the trail that led deeper into the forest. The sound grew louder as we walked until we reached a small clearing. In the center was something strange. A circle of stones, perfectly aligned, and in the middle, a twisted dead tree with branches that seemed to form a sort of hand. When I illuminated the circle, I noticed that the ground was marked with symbols carved into the earth, as if someone had drawn them there recently. "I don't think we should be here," I whispered. Before Andre could respond, something caught our attention. The shadows cast by the trees around us began to move. It wasn't the wind, as the trees were still. The shadows stretched out and seemed to rise from the ground, taking shape. That's when we saw it. A tall, skeletal figure emerged from between the trees, its eyes glowing with a faint, greenish light. Without thinking, we started running back to the camp. The sound of the whispers was now everywhere, mixed with the noise of branches snapping behind us. When we finally reached the clearing where our campfire was, we realized the shadows around us had closed in, forming a circle that seemed to surround us. Andre grabbed a piece of firewood and used it as a torch, trying to push the shadows away. For a moment, it seemed to work, but then we heard a low, guttural scream coming from all directions. The tall figure reappeared, now much closer, with arms extending toward us as if it wanted to reach us. We grabbed our things in a panic and ran out of the valley, following the path we had marked with tape during the day. Every step felt harder, as if the ground itself wanted to hold us back. The shadows followed us, always at the edges of the lantern light. When we finally reached the entrance of the trail, the sound stopped. The shadows disappeared, and silence returned to its absolute form. We got in the car without saying a word and drove away from the place. A few days later, Andre called me, saying that he had started having nightmares about the valley. He dreamt of the shadows always surrounding him, whispering things he couldn't understand. As for me, sometimes on very quiet nights, I feel as if a shadow in the corner of my room moves slightly, just like the ones in the valley. I'm afraid to look for too long. Story 7. The Tree of Despair. My best friend Laura and I have always loved exploring forests and discovering unique places. During a trip, we heard about an isolated area called the Forest of Despair. The name intrigued us, but the locals warned us to stay away, especially because of an ancient tree known as the Tree of Despair. They said that anyone who spent too much time near it would hear voices of people who had lost their lives in the forest. We ignored the warnings and decided to go there. We arrived at the entrance of the forest at noon. It was a dense and dark place, even with the sun still high in the sky. The trees were enormous, with intertwined branches that created moving shadows with the breeze. The air felt heavier there, and there was an unsettling silence. The trail was narrow and poorly marked, but we proceeded enthusiastically, searching for the location of the famous tree. After about an hour of walking, we reached a clearing. In the center of it, there was a massive, twisted tree, with a thick trunk that seemed to be contorted in agony. Its roots spread across the ground, creating deep fissures, and its branches stretched toward the sky like hands begging for help. As we approached, I felt a chill as if the temperature had dropped. Laura, always curious, suggested we take pictures of the tree. While adjusting her camera, I started to hear a low, almost imperceptible sound. It was a whisper coming from the direction of the tree. I stood still, trying to identify the source, but when I looked at Laura, I realized she had heard it too. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded, but seemed uncomfortable. We decided to move away, but as we gathered our things, the whispers grew louder. Now there were several voices overlapping, and they seemed to form words we couldn't understand. When I looked at the tree again, I saw something that froze me. Among the twisted branches, there were faces. They were faint, as if carved into the trunk, but their eyes seemed alive, watching us. "I think we need to get out of here now," Laura said, her voice trembling. I agreed, and we started walking back down the trail. But something was wrong. The forest seemed different, as if the trees were closer together. The path we had followed was covered in leaves, and we couldn't find the marks we had left. As we tried to orient ourselves, the whispers turned into moans and low screams. It was impossible to ignore. Laura began to panic, and I was also struggling to stay calm. Then we realized the clearing was in front of us again. We had returned to the tree. Now the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The tree seemed bigger, more alive, and the faces on its trunk were more defined. The whispers around us grew louder, and we started hearing our own names being called. Laura screamed, pointing to the roots of the tree. They were moving slowly, as if trying to crawl toward us. Without thinking, we grabbed our things and ran through the forest, trying to find the exit. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves followed us the whole way. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we saw the sunlight and ran out of the forest. We reached the car, exhausted and out of breath, too scared to look back. When we got into the vehicle and started the engine, Laura murmured something that sent a chill down my spine. The tree was closer. Since that day, I have nightmares about the tree of despair. In the dreams, I am trapped in the clearing, and the roots slowly reach me while the faces on the trunk silently watch me. Laura also started noticing strange things. Shadows moving in her house and whispers appearing in the silence of the night. We never returned to that forest, but I feel that, in some way, the tree never left us. Story 8. The Field of Lights. My sister, Camila, and I have always been fascinated by strange phenomena. When we heard about the Field of Lights, a hidden area in a forest where mysterious lights appeared at night, we decided we had to see it with our own eyes. The local stories were dark. People who followed the lights often disappeared or returned changed, mute, and with empty stares. We arrived at the entrance of the forest in the late afternoon. It was a remote and enclosed place with trees that seemed older than time. The trail leading to the field was narrow and poorly marked, as if nature itself was trying to hide it. The sun was already low, and the golden light filtering through the leaves gave the place an almost magical yet unsettling appearance. We walked for about 2 hours until we reached a clearing. The field was vast, surrounded by trees that bent inward as if forming a circle. The ground was covered in yellowed grass, and there was a fine mist that seemed to glow with the last rays of sunlight. We decided to set up our tent right in the center of the field. As the sun completely disappeared, silence took over the place. There was no wind, no sound of insects, just the oppressive stillness of the night. That's when we saw the first lights. They were small, floating like fireflies, but much brighter. They danced slowly in the air, forming patterns that seemed deliberate. "They're beautiful," Camila murmured, hypnotized. At first I was fascinated too. The lights seemed to have a life of their own, moving in synchronized patterns. But something felt off. When I looked at Camila, I realized she had gotten up and was walking toward the lights. "Camila, where are you going?" I asked, but she didn't respond. I ran to grab her, but before I could reach her, the lights moved away, drifting deeper into the forest. Camila continued following them as if in a trance. I shouted her name, but she seemed deaf to my voice. I grabbed my lantern and ran after her. As we followed the lights, the environment around us started to change. The trees seemed taller and more twisted, and the mist grew thicker. The sound of my steps and Camila's breathing seemed muffled, as if we were in another place. That's when I realized something terrifying. The lights were leading us in circles. I recognized a fallen tree we had passed earlier, but the path seemed completely different. "Camila, stop!" I yelled, finally managing to reach her. When I grabbed her arm, she stopped abruptly and looked at me. Her eyes were strange, glazed, as if she wasn't fully there. "They're calling me," she said, in a whisper that didn't sound like her voice. Before I could respond, I heard something coming from the trees. It was a low sound, almost like a whisper, but multiplied. They weren't human voices. They sounded like distorted echoes calling our names. When I shone the lantern, I saw something that froze me to my core. Dark figures were standing between the trees. They were tall and thin, with eyes glowing like the lights. I grabbed Camila's hand and we started running. The lights were now surrounding us, moving quickly, almost closing in. The dark figures were also moving, but always on the edges of our vision, never fully visible. The sound of the whispers grew louder, and the feeling of despair intensified with each step. After what seemed like hours, we finally saw the field again. We ran to the clearing, but the lights kept following us, swirling around us like a storm. We grabbed our things in haste and headed back toward the trail that led to the car. Only when we left the forest did the sound of the whispers stop, and the lights disappeared. Camila was silent for the rest of the drive home. In the following days, she began having constant nightmares, saying that the lights were still calling her. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the front door, staring at the horizon. When I asked what she was doing, she replied, "They know where we are." Since then, I avoid any remote places, but sometimes in moments of silence, I see faint lights dancing in the distance as if they're waiting for me. Story 9. The Forest Sanctuary. It was supposed to be just another regular hiking day. My friend Victor and I had planned to explore a dense forest area known as the Forest of Silence. The little information we found about the place mentioned an ancient hidden sanctuary, but it didn't go into much detail. Victor, always curious, was determined to find it. We arrived in the morning. The initial trail seemed normal, although the trees were taller and the air colder than any other place we had visited. As we walked, the silence of the forest began to disturb us. There was no sound from birds, insects, or even the wind. Only our footsteps broke the oppressive stillness. After hours of walking, we came across something strange. A trail of smooth stones, perfectly aligned, stretching into the forest. It looked recent, as if someone had built it to guide visitors. We decided to follow it, intrigued, and that's when things began to change. The trees around us seemed denser and more twisted, and the sunlight barely managed to filter through. The air was heavier, and I began to feel a slight pressure on my head, as if something invisible was watching us. Victor seemed oblivious to this, focused on finding the so-called sanctuary. "It must be close," he said, pointing to a clearing ahead. When we arrived, we saw what looked like the sanctuary. It was a small structure made of stone, with strange inscriptions carved into its walls. In the center stood a statue of a hooded figure, with hands outstretched as if offering something. At the feet of the statue were remnants of candles and objects that appeared to be ancient offerings. The feeling of discomfort grew. The air was cold and the silence was absolute. As Victor examined the inscriptions on the stone, I noticed something disturbing. The shadows around the sanctuary seemed to move, even without any light source to explain it. I blinked, thinking it was my imagination, but the movement continued. "Look at this," Victor called, pointing to one side of the sanctuary. He had found a low door, almost hidden by the vegetation. Against my better judgment, we went inside. The stone corridor was narrow and damp, lit only by our lanterns. At the end, there was a small room with what looked like an altar. On it, there was a stone basin filled with dark liquid that emitted a metallic smell. That's when we heard it. Whispers started to echo through the room even though we were alone. Victor froze, looking around. "It must be the wind," he said, though his voice revealed he didn't believe that. When we illuminated the basin again, the liquid started to move, forming small ripples. Suddenly, a dark figure emerged from the basin, as if rising from the liquid. It was tall and thin, with long arms and a hooded face that resembled the statue outside. Before we could react, the figure stretched a hand toward us. We ran back down the corridor, but the sound of the whispers followed us, now mixed with low, distorted screams. When we exited the sanctuary, we noticed that the forest had changed. The trees seemed closer together, and the stone path we had followed earlier had disappeared. With no other choice, we followed what we thought was the way back. The shadows around us kept moving, forming human figures that seemed to follow us. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we found the original trail and ran to the car. Victor never spoke of the sanctuary again, but I know it left its mark on us. Since that night, I've had recurring dreams about the altar and the stone basin, and I always wake up with the feeling that something is watching me. Sometimes I feel like a shadow is standing in the corner of my room, still but very present. Story 10. The Hill of Laments. My cousin Ricardo and I have always loved challenges. When we heard about a little explored forest called the Hill of Laments, we decided it would be our next destination. Local stories spoke of a hill in the middle of the forest where voices and screams were heard at night, even though no one was around. Some people claimed that the hill was a portal to something dark, but we thought it was just superstition. We arrived at the forest entrance in the early afternoon. The trail was wide at first, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of birds. Everything seemed normal. We walked for hours, but as we got closer to the hill, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest disappeared. Soon, the only sound we could hear was our footsteps on the dry leaves. The hill appeared suddenly in the middle of a clearing. It was tall, with a narrow trail that wound its way to the top. The place had something unsettling about it. The trees around it were dead, their bark peeled off as if something had sucked the life out of them. Ricardo, always curious, insisted that we climb to the top. The climb was slow and silent. Each step felt heavier, as if the hill itself was trying to repel us. When we finally reached the top, we found a small circle of stones in the center. They were arranged strangely, as if they had been placed there deliberately. In the middle of the circle, there was a mark carved into the earth, a symbol neither of us recognized. "Looks like someone did this recently," Ricardo said, pointing to the symbol. As we investigated, it began to get dark quickly, as if the sun had been swallowed by the forest. We decided to descend before night fell completely, but before we could start, we heard the first sound. It was a low, long scream coming from the base of the hill. We looked at each other nervously, but tried to convince ourselves that it was just an animal. As we started to descend, the sounds became more frequent. Now there were murmurs mixed with occasional screams. The words were incomprehensible, but they carried intense emotion: pain, anger, despair. At one point, Ricardo stopped suddenly. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing to the forest. I looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a dark figure between the trees. It was tall, thin, and motionless, but something about it seemed wrong, as if its presence distorted the space around it. I grabbed Ricardo's arm and continued down, trying to ignore the screams and murmurs that now seemed to surround us. When we finally reached the base of the hill, we realized that the trail we had come on was different. The ground was covered with leaves, and the trees seemed closer together. The voices were louder now, and we could hear our own names being called. Ricardo began to panic. "This doesn't make sense. We're trapped," he shouted. As we tried to find the way out, we saw something that made us freeze. In the middle of the trail, the dark figure we had seen earlier was standing, blocking our path. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. When we shone the lantern on it, it simply disappeared as if it had never been there. We ran aimlessly until we finally saw a light in the distance. It was the entrance to the forest. We reached the car, exhausted and panting, and drove off immediately. The whole way back, neither of us said a word. A few weeks later, Ricardo began to act strangely. He said he could hear voices at night calling him back to the hill. One day he simply disappeared. The police found him weeks later back in the forest, standing at the base of the hill, murmuring words that no one could understand. As for me, I've been avoiding remote places ever since. But sometimes in my dreams I see the hill again, and the voices call to me louder each night. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.